Hi everybody. So I wanted to talk about a prevalent sort of attitude that I think is actually quite damaging for people's learning, certainly at the early stages of becoming jazz improvisers. And that's this idea that you always have to improvise. So I'll set aside the debates about exactly how much improvisation goes on in professional jazz. Actually, it really depends from player to player. I've heard stories about players playing pretty much the same solo every night, but other musicians might prefer to be much more spontaneous. A famous example being Sonny Rollins, or perhaps Bill Evans, who said jazz is the art of making a minute's music in a minute's time. So there's different schools of thought on this, and my own personal objective has always been to be an improviser, because it's one of the things I found initially interesting about jazz. But also I understand that jazz is not simply improvisation, it's tradition of music. So I often talk about why I don't like chord scale theory, and one of the most important reasons, it's funny because I use chord scale theory a lot, on the channel, but I think one of the reasons I think it's misapplied in jazz education, especially in the early stages. So, for instance, you learn a song like Little Sunflower by Freddie Hubbard, which is basically three scales. It's D Dorian, it's E flat Lydian, D Lydian, in the B section. And this is pretty much the first thing I learned, and then you noodle around on these chord scales, and what comes out is pleasant and inoffensive and invariably sounds nothing like jazz. And it didn't in my case, and it won't in most people's cases. Unless you're maybe Gwilym Simcock or something and you've just listened to a load of Keith Jarrett and then assimilate it via some form of witchcraft. That's another story. But for most of us, that approach doesn't work. It might be good in that it gets us improvising, and that's maybe not a bad thing. But I think some people are more given to finding that helpful than others. So people who are already very sensitive musicians might be noodling around on their chord scale and think to themselves, this doesn't really sound like Charlie Parker, and they'd be right. Other people who are just happy just to make a noise and, might not have, I wasn't a very good musician at that point, I didn't really know what was going on, hadn't really listened to any jazz, so how do I know the difference anyway? Was just happy just to noodle up and down my chord scales, and then eventually I became slightly less kind of insensitive at music, if that makes any sense, as I listened to more jazz and as I realised that what I was doing wasn't sounding like jazz. So I kind of feel like it's more helpful to divide it into two categories, like this early learning. And the first is improvisation. I think it's quite important to get into improvisation. I think there's, it can be useful to cross that Rubicon for a lot of people. I do think for obviously for the sensitive musicians I mentioned, but also people who are perhaps a bit less, forwards in coming forwards, shall we say, might just go, well, I don't want to suck in front of everybody. Well, I don't want to take a solo on this. This doesn't sound good, That other person who just took a solo, they didn't sound very good. Why would I want to do that? And I think that tendency is actually probably means that a lot of people might fall by the wayside or decide that jazz improvisation is not for them. So that's definitely a problem I have with this approach. That said, I think it is, as I say, useful for people to cross that Rubicon, but I think it achieves a different goal. And the goal is not to learn jazz, it's just to improvise something. So what do we do to learn jazz? Well, we study the music, so that means listening to, for instance, Charlie Parker, but whoever your favourite players are. For me, it was Parker that really gave me a grounding, I think, in jazz language, along with, Charlie Christian and a few other players. You could study whatever players appeal to you, it doesn't have to be those guys. And that gives you a basic sort of idea of how it works. And typically people learn licks, and then they run those licks into other licks and solos. And, you can get sounding pretty good in a short amount of time. There's plenty of teenagers who just do that. They sound good. So, that's obviously the time honoured way to get up to the point where you can actually go and be functional as a jazz musician. You're not yet really improvising, and you haven't got your own sound, your own voice, but you have the mechanics together, and that's where a lot of people start. It's not quite how it went for me, but that's another story I'll tell another time. And for people sort of studying, for instance, the Barry Harris system or styles of music where you kind of are constructing language, I often think it's really important to compose. And people are like, oh, should we compose our solos? Shouldn't we be improvising? And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. I mean, if you improvise, you can only improvise what you already know. So, I mean, if what you already know is, which as it is for most guitar players, then you're not going to be able to play bebop, but just by improvising, it's not going to happen. You're going to play blues. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with blues. But if you want to extend your vocabulary, then you need to learn vocabulary. You need to apply it in a very strict way, and then eventually it will start to become natural. It takes a long time, actually. So that's one side of it. The other side is I think it's kind of a little bit of I feel like improvisation is more the art of variation than it is the art of coming up with something off the top of your head. So, for instance, if I've got, some kind of 2-5-1 lick, like this is something that I play all the time, add in another bit or double it and play up here, like same thing, up an octave. Maybe what are we starting on? So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. How does it sound on the beat? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and ends up on the beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and so you might start it in a different place rhythmically. Or you might go, okay, well actually 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. So I've taken out a note to make sure that when I start on the upbeat, I end up on the beat. Little variation procedures like that, Or I might sort of go, well, I played this line in major, can I put it in minor? Can I take it through the keys? Different fingerings, all those sorts of things would be the way you might vary bebop language. You might take a melody, for instance, Autumn Leaves. Might start varying the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Like that, or you might sort of add in some notes. Then so rather than it being like, okay, I have an idea just off the top of my head that I'm going to use in a solo, my improvisations tend to be on the whole variations of ideas that I already know. So I try to put the variations in to keep it fresh, but I have a sort of repertoire of things that I already play. I mean, in some cases, like, obviously on tunes like rhythm changes or giant steps or something, when it's fast, you're going to need to have a repertoire of pre-baked things that you play. Like over any of these chord progressions, you just have to practice these things to start off with. So the idea that you would be spontaneous over this stuff is daft. And actually you can hear on many recordings things like stalemates and hard tunes like that. Some of the people in the session who perhaps haven't composed the tune, they'll often just play the melody in that bit. It's like, well, I know this bit works over these chords. So there's lots of little things that people do that aren't improvisation. And I sort of want to push back a bit against this kind of idea that, oh, well, everything has to be completely spontaneously improvised, otherwise it's not really music. It's like, no, if it sounds good, it is good. Don't let the jazz police ruin your day. Don't let them ruin your learning.